All right. Thank you, everybody. Hello. We're thrilled that all of you can join us today for this virtual panel discussion on The Age of Nature, a three-part documentary series which aired on PBS this fall. My name is Bianca Sheed, and I'm the Director of Global Strategic Communications at the Nature Conservancy, and I will be moderating what we hope will be a very exciting discussion today. So first, I'm going to introduce our panelists to you. We have Verity White, who is series producer for The Age of Nature, Giulio Boccaletti, who is Chief Strategy Officer with the Nature Conservancy and a series consultant, and Bill Gardner, Vice President of Programming and Development at PBS. So during today's presentation, we're going to share some tips from the episodes taken from stories right around the world, and our panel of experts are going to discuss how the stories came about, how they relate to conservation, and how everybody plays a part in conservation. And there's going to be room at the end for some Q&A, so please pop your questions in the chat box as they come up and we'll work our way through them. But to get everything started, let's kick off with the trailer for The Age of Nature.
We understand our planet better than ever before. But the world is changing fast.
We are not powerless. We show the world this is what can be done.
I know that humanity will persevere. We will prevail.
How we live with nature now will determine our future.
Every second breath we take comes from the ocean.
Now that we're finding ways to help nature, we can see the potential to restore the Earth.
When given time, protection, and space, nature can come back.
When humans stop messing things up, nature will rebound.
If we allow it to, nature can do more than we ever imagined.
Not only is this a beautiful environment, but it's one that can actually save us against climate change.
It's time to turn to nature for help. It's time for The Age of Nature.
I'm sure the time will eventually come when I don't get goosebumps when I watch that, but for now it still gets me every time. It's just stunning. So Bill, I would like to start with you, please, and it's a three-part question actually. So first of all, part one, what was it that inspired PBS to develop this series? Second part is, how did PBS connect with the Nature Conservancy? And then third, which I'm really excited to hear about, is what's the reception to the series been like?
Well, thank you, Bianca, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We're really excited to be just speaking in more detail about this film. I was really excited when this was first pitched to me by Brian Leith and Mandy Leith of Brian Leith Productions, which is where Verity works, because what PBS is really focusing on in this space of natural history, of high-end conservation themed documentaries, is content that really illustrates that we as people have a role in the environment. We are of the world, we impact it, we are impacted by it. And we're especially interested in telling stories that focus on solutions to some of the issues that we face, and people coming together to try to interrogate the issues and deal with them in a productive way. We think that doom and gloom stories about the state of the planet, they don't really have much of an impact because there aren't any opportunities to learn or to grow or to effectively do anything about it, right? And as we as a system are built on local stations all over the country, over 360 of them, we really look for content that can give opportunities for people to be inspired and take action in their own communities. And this particular project really illustrated the impact of these types of things that can happen all over the world, where people coming together can really have a positive impact on what that does. And it's also magnified by the relationship that we have with the Nature Conservancy. We have been partners in the past on other projects. I know Giulio well, Stella Cha, I know her really well. And in many cases, what we really like to do on our larger projects is find ways that we can partner with other organizations that are also on the ground. And the Nature Conservancy, because they have chapters all over the country, in many cases, they can affiliate with our local stations that are there. in the similar communities, and really leverage efforts to get people feeling that there is something that they can do in their own communities that is a positive impact on the world around them. And I'm sorry, what was the third question you asked?
How has it been received?
Of course, yes. Wonderfully. It's just got great feedback. And in fact, one of the things that I'm most proud of is we were asked to share some of the content from this film with the UN conference coming up in Glasgow that illustrates the impact that people on the ground, especially Indigenous communities, can have on affecting issues of climate change. So we've gotten great feedback from audiences, and certainly on the ground, the impact that this has, which is very important to us. Impact of our content. This isn't just about raising awareness, but it's inspiring people to take action in their own communities.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Bill. Giulio, turning to you, a two-part question for you. Bill spoke about the importance of nature providing solutions. Can you just give us a couple of examples of where the Nature Conservancy is delivering these nature-based solutions? And then a different perspective, what's the value for the Nature Conservancy in getting involved in something like the Age of Nature series?
Sure, and pleasure to be with all of you. I'll try to remember both questions. So on the first one, you know, in a sense, the Nature Conservancy everywhere in the world is trying to kind of introduce nature as the fundamental structural solution to the sustainability of humanity on this planet. And so whether we're working in the Mississippi Basin on soil health, because soils end up, you know, sequestering carbon, cleaning water, and producing food, or whether it's working in South Africa, in Cape Town, as is shown in this series, trying to protect the watershed, whether it's restoring forestry in Indonesia, whether it's, you know, working on the rivers of the northeast of the United States, you know, Boston up into Maine. All of this work is really about kind of making nature part of the solution, part of the security infrastructure of our economy. And so it's you know, pretty much every way we work at this point, you can sort of point to the work that we're doing as a kind of triple win. It wins because it protects nature for nature's sake. It wins because it protects nature for what it does to the people that live there. But it also wins because it protects nature as part of the infrastructure of humanity for living on this planet. Now, why does this series matter to us, and why telling the story matter to us? Because I suspect, you know, half of the people listening right now didn't understand a word of what I said, and it's probably not just because of my accent. The reality is this work is incredibly wonky and complicated. You know, ecosystem science is a complicated science, and then you get into sort of talking about it very generically. You know, we're protecting the Mississippi, but how do you make this real? And so, you know, as conservationists, we look at nature, we look at the landscape, and we see the solutions, right? In our world, nature is not just a theater. It's not just a stage on which things happen. It's an agent. It's a thing that does stuff to us. And the question that I, you know, when I was talking to Bill and to Verity and to Brian Leith and others over the years, as we were thinking about this series, is how do you make that story come alive? How do you make nature come alive as a character in the life of people on this planet? If we manage that, if we manage to get the audiences to see the world as we see it, then I believe we can make a lot more progress. And that's what this series, I think, has done.
Yeah, and quite brilliantly. Verity, there are some stunning stories in this, but at some point you have to make a selection, which I imagine must be quite challenging. But how do you actually choose the particular stories to focus on for a series like Age of Nature?
Well, it was quite difficult. One of the positive aspects was that there's actually quite a lot of positive, good news stories to choose from these days. There's a lot of people across the world doing some wonderful things to help nature. And we really wanted to go as far across the world as we could, because it's really important to get a global perspective on the state of the planet. We didn't want to just see it from our own perspective. We wanted to talk to people who live in different places, different parts of the world, that's suffering from different problems and finding different solutions. And the other thing that we really wanted to do was, rather than just pick out sort of small but sweet case studies, we wanted to find stories that could be replicated, that could be expanded, that people could think, oh, well, maybe we could do that over here, or maybe that could apply to something else. So stories that effectively potential to be a little bit world changing was what we were looking for.
You teed this up perfectly, because we're going to now show a clip from the hilly landscapes of China, where, talking about scale, you really have the opportunity to make change, transformational change at scale. And this clip from the series shows one of the largest land rehabilitation projects ever attempted. So it started in 1994, and it's just mind-blowing.
So what they did was they paid the people to redevelop the landscape.
In 1994, work began in earnest on one of the biggest land rehabilitation projects ever attempted. The hills were terraced to slow the flow of water, allowing it to soak into the soil.
The scale of this was just unbelievable. When you went out there and you saw that they were using just hand tools or simple machinery, and that they were doing this over vast areas. And of course, revegetation was a big part of it. The top had to be trees and had to be totally vegetated, totally reforested.
John has documented the results ever since.
I put my tripod here and looked out at these areas back in 1995. Well, this is a change. This is amazing. If you can take a place that has been destroyed over thousands of years and bring it back to life, this is pretty astonishing. It took a long time to degrade, but actually the restoration is going much faster. Now you can see in 25 years, it's completely different. And this is done by ordinary people. This is huge. This is the way forward.
In just a generation, the land has returned to health.
And just before we jump into the next questions, just a reminder to all participants, if you have any questions for the panelists or any comments, please pop them in the Q&A box in Zoom here. So Bill, I mean, that was just a tiny clip, and yet it told a huge story. How did that part of China get in such a state of degradation in the first place? And why do you particularly like this story as a springboard for the bigger nature story?
Well, I think John said it really, really well. About what is so inspiring about it is people coming together, ordinary people making a huge difference. What happened there on the List Plateau is, as he said, over thousands of years of just types of land use of people just, tilling the land. The wind came in and blew a lot of the topsoil away, and just thousands of years of intensive usage of that land and deforestation and so forth had an impact over time. That's frankly similar to what happened in the States with the Dust Bowl story. It was just agricultural use that was done without really understanding what the impact was, and the soil blew away. So this is something that happens based on human activity. At the same time, it's something that we can recover from, again, through human activity. And one of the things that I find so inspiring and interesting about this particular section is that it is a collective action that was taken, a decision was made. And from a media perspective, I think many of us who work in this space trying to educate, entertain, and inspire the audience about these types of issues, it's not just about raising awareness of what's going on out there, it's also inspiring people that they can actually do something about it. Because people can understand what's going on, but then if you see a solution where action is centrally taken, because I think where we are at now in the world is policy decisions need to be made to actually preserve environments and bring them back. And this story is a great example of that. And as John said, you can go from thousands of years of degradation within a generation. Nature can recover. Nature is part of the solution, as Giulio said really, really well. It's not something that's just out there that we're powerless to impact in or impacted by, but with collective action where people going out there and just doing very simple things, nature will recover, it will rebound. And I think that is an incredibly inspiring story, that you see something at scale in a very agrarian place. If people are working together, you saw what that impact could be.
Yeah, very tangible impacts in a relatively short space of time. So we are, our next clip is going to be based from South Africa, which features our Nature Conservancy friend and colleague, Louise Stafford, who's Director of Water Funds in South Africa. And it covers the work that she and her team have been doing to help mitigate Cape Town's water scarcity issues. Verity, can you speak to this story a bit once we've watched the clip?
Louise Stafford, Water Director at the Nature Conservancy, is an expert on the ecosystem here.
Most of the invasive species that we find in the watersheds of the Cape Town region come from Europe and Australia.
The pine tree was introduced 200 years ago for its timber.
In comparison to fynbos, the pine trees are huge trees with deep taproot systems, and they actually use more water than the native species. And if you look at the system in Cape Town, about 70% of the watershed upon which Cape Town depends for its water is invaded by alien plants. The region is losing 55.5 billion litres of water every year as a result of alien plants in the catchments. And it equates to about 2 months' water supply just for the city of Cape Town itself.
So Verity, tell us a bit more about this one. And if the clip had been longer, we'd see some of the most rock and roll adventurous conservation that you are likely to see in quite some time.
Yes, it certainly gave us a good action sequence. So, I mean, the way we came about this story really was the 2018 water crisis of Cape Town was big news. It was on the news here in the UK. I'm sure it was on the news all around. It was due to be the first major city to officially run out of water, and then sort of the rains came and there was respite just in time. And we went to that story from the angle of having been a fair way down the development with the Age of Nature. Surely there's a nature story behind this. And then it turns out that it was one of the TNC projects, and there's a huge nature story behind it. And it was perfect for what we wanted to say, that you know, an ecosystem that's as unique as the fynbos, which is very, very old ecosystem, and very particular to that region, very delicate, very finely balanced, for, if that's the right word, kind of ecosystem. And the invasive species, the pine trees, that which don't look too much trouble, just sort of when you're walking past, drinking 40% of the water that should be going into the reservoirs, which is huge. And it's a very clear problem, and with a clear, very difficult but clear solution. So that was a great story for us from that perspective.
And Giulio, what is the solution in Cape Town? What is this rock and roll conservation?
Well, you know, the story of Cape Town is extraordinary because it's sort of the archetype. So essentially the invasive species that Verity was talking about, the pines and eucalyptus, drink about 2 months of water of the supply of the city a year. So every year, 2 months of water disappear because it goes through the trees instead of coming down. And so the restoration of the fynbos, of the traditional ecosystem, releases 2 months of water back into the system. Now, if you remember, as Verity was saying, Cape Town got close to day zero, right? I mean, they were counting down to the moment in which they would have to effectively turn off the taps to 4 million citizens, right? And so the solution is really to recognize that the watershed around the city is the utility on which the city depends. Nature, it turns out, is the utility that the planet has given us to provide the fundamental service of water security. Now, what's interesting about Cape Town, I should say, is that what Louise and others have been doing is that they are structuring nature in the financing of the municipal utility. So for those of you listening who are interested in finance and impact investment, this is probably the best example I can think of nature-based impact investment, in that we're going to essentially get the rates of water rates of the city to pay for the restoration into the watershed. And it turns out this is a solution that can be replicated everywhere in the world. I mean, it's not the specifics of the ecosystem, of course, but the idea that you can get downstream users to pay for the security that comes from nature upstream, and that solution is the best and cheapest, is true in over 1,000 cities larger than 100,000 people across the world. And TNC is doing a lot of this work in 30, 40 cities around the world. We have this kind of work called a water fund. So it's really exciting, and you should watch the series if you haven't seen it, because there's lots of helicopter action immediately after this, the sequence that you just saw.
And Verity, we've just had a question about the music and how you select the music, and I think that clip was a really good example where there's very dramatic music. How do you choose it, and is there an element of kind of psychology in your choice of music for the different sequences?
Yes, well, we had a lovely composer called John Wiggins, who we worked with to produce the music for the series. John was somebody who's very connected to nature himself, and we were trying to sort of create a personality and a character for nature within the series. And music is a great tool for adding depth and layers of emotion, and as well as helping to steer the story. You can get so much from a nicely composed track. It helps set your tone, and it helps guide you. We don't like to tell people how to feel about things. We like to sort of be a bit more supportive than that. But yeah, and it can be fun when you have a bit of an action sequence to sort of turn up the tempo.
Brilliant.
Okay, if I can just add one thing to this, because I had the good fortune of being in some of the edit process as an observer, and Verity is absolutely right, because the music changed over the course of time from the first attempts to this, and it makes a massive difference to me as a viewer and how I respond to the imagery. And that's really what we wanted to bring here. Is, TNC is full of scientists. We're not necessarily, I mean, we may be accidental storytellers, but what you need is somebody who knows how to tell stories in a way that's really emotive. I think Verity and her colleagues have done a phenomenal job here.
I would agree. I am very fortunate to work at the Nature Conservancy, so I get exposed to all kinds of exciting nature stories. There are still parts of this series that blew me away and got me really excited. One of which was the Panama Canal story, and the connection between the Panama Canal and nature is quite a difficult connection to make, but then you have a light bulb moment. So I would love it if we could watch that clip.
The building of the Panama Canal was the dream of humanity, of mankind. It just united the world.
Opened in 1914 after 30 years of construction. This was an incredible feat of engineering. Still in operation today. Each vessel is raised up into the canal and down the other side through a series of colossal locks.
Every ship that goes through the Panama Canal requires about 50 million gallons of fresh water from the Chagres. Every ship. And there are 40 ships a day, so you multiply that, and it's an astronomical quantity of fresh water. It's the energy, the water of the Chagres that makes possible the Panama Canal.
Without this river, there would be no Panama Canal. Back in the 70s, the government of the time wanted the land to be more productive. So they encouraged people to create pastures. The forest began to disappear.
I started studying anthropology, and I was asked to study the peasants of the Panama Canal watershed. So in 1979, I went to the canal watershed, and that to me was a revelation. I had no idea of how serious this situation was.
I just wanted to say thank you to those who are sending questions in. We will get to them. I think we've got one more clip after this one, so we will start getting to some of those questions after that. So please don't think I'm ignoring you. I promise I'm not. But I wanted to ask first Giulio, and then perhaps pass straight to Bill about this particular story. I know, Giulio, it's one of your favourites. Why is that? And then Bill, to you next. Why was it so important? Because it's very near the beginning of the series. Why is it so important to the series?
Yeah, so this is, there's at least three very quick things that I should say about this. The first is that the Panama Canal story is really the story from which the series originated. And it's a story that Brian Leith, who works with Verity at Brian Leith Productions, originally told me 7 years ago over pizza, which is how we ended up sort of then talking about this potential for this series. It's a really compelling story because if you think that the story of nature in society and the economy is sort of a sideshow, yes, it's nice, but in the end, really, does it really matter? Well, this is a piece of infrastructure upon which essentially, global trade depends on, and the functioning of this piece of infrastructure, the Panama Canal, is entirely dependent on the functioning of the Chagres River, which itself is entirely dependent on the hydrological functioning of the Mesoamerican forest. And so you have this massive piece of infrastructure, at the time the biggest in the world. It depends on a river which, for water, depends itself on this massive live ecosystem, an ecosystem which incidentally is also home to a number of indigenous tribes. And so it's really in one place, it's kind of a perfect model of what we're talking about. The entire sort of world economy ultimately depending on the hydrology of this relatively small forest upstream of the piece of infrastructure, and so it's a really interesting story, and it's a story of hope, because of course the Panama Canal for a while was in danger, but the management of the Mesoamerican forest has ensured that water keeps going into that. And the last thing I should say is, incidentally, Stanley, the professor who's shown in this, was the boss of Bill Ulfelder, who's the state director for New York for the Nature Conservancy for a number of years. So there's also kind of an interesting TNC connection here. But it's a spectacular story and a spectacular sequence.
And Bill, what role does this sequence play in the bigger series?
Well, as these things are coming together, you're talking about what sequences can go where and what leads to another and helps build a larger argument. And from the beginning, we always thought that this should be at the very top. For many of the reasons that Giulio just laid out, from a storytelling perspective, that is the case as well. The Panama Canal is something that people know about, they understand. I think the story that's there has a beginning and a middle and an end. It has an arc that you can follow and connect to. And so from that perspective, the audience can grab onto it right away, follow along with something that they know. And at the same time, it really pushes through a lot of the ethics of what this series is going to be about, not just that nature is part of the solution. It's a major action that we as humans took, years and years ago. And it also sends the message that we can be really active in the environment. We cut a trench across an isthmus of an entire continent. That's a pretty amazing engineering feat. But then saving it and adjusting to things as they arise is also a huge effort. But it was done, and it was done by central action, by scientists describing the issue, presenting a solution, and then governments making the decision to do it, to deal with this. And it had huge global impact. So basically the entire ethic of what we're trying to get across in this series is encapsulated in this one story that people can connect to and understand and get invested in.
Brilliant. And yeah, I think the connection, it just makes so much sense, linking economy to nature. It was a real light bulb moment for me. Now, Verity, when we were chatting yesterday, I naively assumed that you would get to fly all around the world on lots of glamorous and exciting shoots. And you said, as series producer, it's not quite like that anymore, but there was a particular sequence that you were part of. So we're going to watch a clip from the story of the cod in Norway, and then you can tell us what it was like on the ground or on the sea.
At 6 a.m., the fishing day starts. People have worked these shores since the time of the Vikings.
Man har ju en far som var fiskare. Så alle mine forfedre har jo vært fiskere. Så det må være et gen der som ligger i slekta. Fiske har jo veldig viktig for Lofoten i masser av generasjoner, og det er det jo ennå frem igjennom. Det er et liv som jeg liker, rett og slett. Jeg kan ikke tenke meg til å bytte.
In its heyday, in the 1950s, over 30,000 of these small boats would land more than 1 million tons of Arctic cod every year, without any restrictions on how much they could catch. It was assumed that this vast resource could never be exhausted.
Even many scientists said fishing doesn't matter much, because you cannot deplete a stock by just fishing.
But nobody really knew how the stocks were doing. So in the 1960s, Odd Nakken began to investigate.
I was very interested in how to find out how much fish there is in the ocean.
By studying cod numbers at sea, rather than assessing the annual catch, scientists got a much clearer picture of the impact of fishing. And the timing was important, as the industry was changing. By the 70s, trawlers were making huge catches, and the smaller fleets were still unregulated.
Everyone tried to harvest as much as he can, of course. It was very, very wasteful fishing. A lot of the fish were thrown overboard because it was too small for the markets. And if you fish out the small fish, there will be no big fish some few years later.
Even with such heavy fishing, scientists predicted that cod numbers would grow because of increased spawning.
In the end of the 1980s, we could see a lot of young ones up in the Barents Sea. And on that basis, we said that there should be a marvelous, good cod stock at the end of the 1990s.
But the fish never came.
Det ble bare plutselig helt veldig dårlig med fiske fremme kysten. Og ingen forstod jo hvor fisken var da. Han ble bare rett og slett borte torsken for oss. Vi var jo i fiske, og så ble det jo sendt ut melding. Det var jo på radio. Den og den datoen var det stopp, og da var det bare å gå hjem. Vi fikk ikke lov å fiske mer. Vi forstod oss ikke på det her, hva som skjedde. Det ble bare veldig, veldig dårlig, altså, for kystflåten.
The disappearance of the cod was linked to another species of fish.
The capelin stock broke down, and that's the main food for the big cod. And what do the big cod do when there is no capelin? They eat other small fishes. So the cannibalism in the cod stock increased tremendously in those years.
The cod were eating their own young. This, combined with overfishing, caused the population to crash by 75%. They had to stop fishing before there was nothing left.
So Verity, tell us a bit more about that story and also what it was like to be there and meet the people who are the main characters in this section.
Well, it was eye-opening sort of every moment of that shoot. It was a bit cold to start with, which sort of heightens the senses, and then we spent the day out with Rolf on his fishing boat, and we were sort of as lucky as we could have been, and that the water was like glass. And there was no wind, and so we had a very easy ride. But even still, it was we were out there in the dark, trying not to fall over, trying to keep out of Rolf's way, who's determined not to be late, because they do start at 6 o'clock. It's an old tradition, and then nobody goes out before 6, I think, to keep the competition fair. So at 6 o'clock, the fishermen are all ready to go. And obviously when there's a film crew running about your feet, that's probably going to slow you down. So we were doing our best to help him get on his way. And then we had a very long-legged cameraman who was sort of leaping around on this icy boat, which was very alarming to watch, and trying to sort of, just capture a day in the life, what it was like to be out there. And I think sort of we all came back in feeling like we'd like to be cod fishermen, because it was so beautiful. And it was such an experience, and just seeing all these fish sort of coming out from the depths and realizing sort of a little insight into another layer, I suppose. We don't often see what goes on beneath the surface, and we could suddenly realize that there was all this life down there, and that was coming up out the water and onto the boat. And then he told his story, and that was Rolf didn't speak any English, so we interviewed him in Norwegian, and it turned out that it just wasn't working for the translator to then tell me what he said into English, and then for me to have a think. And then so I just had to let them get on with it. And 1 minute the guy's laughing, and the next minute he just looks like he's going to cry, and I'm thinking, oh God, what's he saying? What's he telling us? And he was telling us the story that you heard about what it was like when they, over the radio one day, they said, guys, you've got to stop fishing. So we've just experienced that with Corona, haven't we? Being told you can't go to work, and that's that, go home. Sort of horrible experience. And you could really see how, even though it was 30 years ago, he still felt that very keenly. And then we moved over to Odd Naken, who was really able to explain it from the scientific perspective. Which again, if you sort of think back to the 60s when Odd started, his story is wonderful. He wondered how many fish there were in the ocean, because nobody knew. They hadn't worked out how to count them yet, and they were sort of developing sonar, which is what they still use today to count the fish, and they monitor those fish stocks now like they're sort of like their lives depend on them, which they do, and that's a part of the film that we didn't quite see today. But yeah, hugely eye-opening on many different fronts. And to hear Odd's story, I mean, when we were wondering who was going to tell us about what happened when we first started looking, unfortunately, some of the key players are no longer with us. And Odd himself was 84. So we're asking a lot from him to sort of take up his time and energy and sort of to tell us. But he was very glad to tell us what happened back in the day and his perspective on it. So we felt very privileged to get that insight.
Yeah, the storytelling is beautiful. And so Giulio, this we didn't, we saw the problem set up here in this clip, but what we didn't see was how, again, nature came up with the solution. So in this situation, how did nature heal and recover?
Well, again, it's, and this is the management of fisheries, the sustainable management of fisheries, something that the Nature Conservancy does a lot of, both the Atlantic and the Pacific and across the world. And it's really about recognizing that these are really complex dynamical systems where, it's sort of if you manage it for abundance instead of for scarcity, you end up actually recovering. And that's where they've gotten today is, the fish stocks have, to some extent recovered. And what we wanted to capture, and what this sequence captured so well, is the fact that it's not, natural resources of this kind are not like, they're not like oil, right? They're not mineral sources. You're not digging them out of the ground and then however much there is, that's what you take. This is a live system that replenishes itself. There is energy there that reorders matter, right? And so I think it's, this whole story is how these communities learned through regulation, through management practices to ultimately allow these systems to recover. But if I may just say one last thing on the points that Verity was making so eloquently, I think one of the strengths of the series for us is just the sheer diversity and chorality of all of these stories, because each one of these stories is compelling in its own right, and it's a small example. But then I think you have 30 plus such stories across the 3 episodes of the series, and it starts giving you a sense that across types of people, experiences, life experiences, backgrounds, places. This story is true everywhere. You allow nature to recover and it will support the communities that depend on it. And so anyway, so this is a very good example of that sort of recurring insight.
Bill, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Just to expand on what Giulio said in terms of how we think of our role as a public broadcaster, is we really love this series in many cases because it has so many different diverse stories in which various communities all over the country can then see perhaps things that are relevant in their communities in those stories that are applicable and lessons that can be learned about. There can be successes and models for how this type of actions can be taken. I myself grew up in Maine, on the coast. So the fisheries story there is really important in the way we regulate the lobster fishing and all that sort of thing, and the impact of climate change is, it's moving north, and how do you deal with that? So seeing stories that are taking place in Norway about how actions were taken, again, through a social decision is made at a larger level and policy has to go with it. Laws need to be passed. It's not just about being aware of the issues, but really action being taken, and it can have an impact. Whether you're talking about a really successful story in Norway or more difficult challenges in other parts of the world as things are changing, there are lessons that can be learned and again are very applicable to the communities that we serve. The United States is a very, very broad continent. The issues of the Southwest and the Northwest and the Midwest and the Northeast, they're not necessarily the same, but there are things that can be applied and pulled out of it. And it's why having a partnership with an organization like the Nature Conservancy or working through our stations is so important, because I like to think of our content as like a sphere. There is the linear broadcast on television that's the hub of the project. And what are the nodes that come off of that? This is one of those nodes, this conversation we're having here, things that exist in social media, the educational offerings that we can put through PBS Learning Media, all of it resides around this very large project that we're doing, of which the Age of Nature is an excellent example. And there are many ways to get into this. So it may be a situation like what we've done here in this particular conversation with really interesting short stories that we can all talk about, that people can take something from and act on. Other folks aren't going to have the access to something like this. They're going to see the show on the air and they'll take their impact from what they see there. Our social media campaigns, work that you all, the Nature Conservancy, are doing to magnify that, really shows the power of what media, particularly public media, can do in partnership with organizations like the TNC to bring this information to audiences in ways that they can personally find relevant. And again, as I launched into this conversation, the thing that's really exciting to me about this series, and I think Verity and team did a great job of, is really focusing on the people on the front lines of these battles, of these efforts. There are first-person narratives about the reality of the things that they're facing, the solutions they're putting forth. It's not as much as you'll hear Giulia and I talk about the things that we can talk about from where we sit in our kitchens. At the same time, the folks who are out there on the ground are living these experiences, and they're taking the actions through their local communities and their governments to try to effect change. And that, to me, is what really good, strong media is about, is expressing hope, positivity, and opportunity to impact your world. And I think the team here did an amazing job of highlighting that, and I'm really, really proud that I could put it on our air.
That was almost a mic drop moment, Bill. That was you said it. So we are moving on to open Q&A now. So please do pop your questions or comments in the chat, and we will do our best to get to all of them. Giulio, the first one is for you, and it relates specifically to Cape Town, but I think it's applicable to many, many cities around the world. So the question begins: how did the reservoir get started? Nature wants to grow in that area, and that would sequester carbon, but the city's outgrown its ecosystem. How does that happen?
So it's important to note, and this goes to a question that somebody else asked, the city hasn't outgrown the ecosystems, behaviors and management have. You can have a city the size of Cape Town that's perfectly capable of surviving within the ecosystem that surrounds it. It so happens that the way in which the ecosystem and the watershed was managed was and is unsustainable. So Cape Town grew, it's 4 million people. There's a whole long story about kind of the nature of the demographics, but it's a large city that has a relatively modern, water infrastructure system. Imagine big reservoirs, pipes that bring water into the city, and then it gets delivered. The problem is that it doesn't rain an enormous amount, and so when it does, you need the rain mostly to fill the reservoirs. But what was happening was that people had planted all these invasive species, pines, eucalyptus. If you ask yourself why, because people liked a European aesthetic. I mean, it's really as unfortunate as that, right? So and they got rid of the adapted ecosystem that was capable of surviving and thriving, in fact, in that arid environment. And so the process that we're going through ourselves and others is to restore that original ecosystem. If we do that, we'll have the water system functioning better, and the city will be able to supply the water it needs. And by the way, you'll have a much more a kind of effective ecosystem, which may be able to survive changes in climate and which may be able to sequester a fair amount of carbon.
Perfect. Verity, this next one's for you, and it's focused on something quite specific, but I think it is applicable across a whole range of areas and solutions. So the question is, will this series or concept continue to expand to recognise and raise awareness about small organisations and individuals who work locally on conservation and revitalisation of nature in urban or suburban watersheds? And Liz, am I right in thinking you also have a contribution to this? No, right. Oh, yes.
I don't. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I hope so is the answer. I think you can't sort of, once you've been part of the age of nature, it's something that's clearly the only way forward. And we're sort of working up new ideas all the time. And there are so many stories we didn't get to tell, and you know, big stories, small stories. I think all the case studies are important. So yeah, we'd love to keep building on what we've learned. I've certainly learned a huge amount over the last couple of years. In fact, I was in a brainstorm going back to Cape Town just recently, and Cape Town came up and somebody said, oh, you know, they've just not invested in the infrastructure of the water there. It's a disgrace. And I sort of nearly leapt out of my seat and there's no, that's not the problem. He was sort of quite surprised and interested to hear the story. So we're sort of never going to stop now. So how that comes out sort of to be broadcast, I couldn't tell you yet, but we're certainly still working on it. So hopefully soon.
And I think, Giulio, you can attest to this, to the fact that TNC, whilst, you know, we are one organisation in a huge ecosystem of other partnerships and networks. And so quite often we have on the ground partners on a lot of our projects who actually do the work because they know the area better and they know the challenges better. Do you want to speak to that a bit?
Well, for sure. I mean, I think in the end, you know, all of our work is geographically specific. And the people best suited to confront the challenges on the ground are those who are the stewards of those places, which are the people that live there. And so the vast majority of our work is through communities. Now, in the case of the United States, we have a large on-the-ground presence. And of course, we are part of the communities locally, and that's true in a number of other countries. But often what we do is we support local organizations, smaller local organizations that are then able to intervene in the groundscape. Incidentally, as is the case in Cape Town and in some of the other clips that you just saw, where it's always kind of some local institution. Now, I should add, however, that you shouldn't take away from this the story that the answer is solely about community engagement. That is a crucial piece of the answer. But another equivalently important part is what Bill was alluding to earlier, which is you then need governments to create regulatory frameworks and policies to scale these things up to really have impact at a scale commensurate to the problem. And so we operate at both levels.
Bill, we've had a lovely comment that I hope will inspire a comment from you as well. So Susan Evans has said, what I loved about the programme was that it helped humans realise the invisible chain reaction between what's perceived as an initial substantiating act of helping humans can, in fact, down the chain, be a disaster for all.
You know, I mean, that is a great comment. And it's one of the things that we really try to highlight in our broad content, not just in this particular project, but everything we're doing in this space, and is to try to get people to have a bigger picture, to pull back and see what our impact is on the environment and role is. You know, in many cases, some of the issues that we're facing today, they're coming from people whose heart was in the right place. They thought they were doing the right thing in terms of public policy. I mean, you can look at infrastructure of how highways were built and, you know, the Cross Bronx Expressway and all, you know, all this sorts of things that well-minded people thought that this was the right way to do things. So the more that we can do to educate and look at in context and take the big picture and look back about what impacts are down the road, we think that that's part of our function. You know, we look at the public broadcasting service as a service to the public. And the more that we can provide context and long lenses of history and really thoughtful science-based understanding of the topics that we're all facing, then that's part of our role. And, you know, as Giulio has just alluded to here, it's not just looking on the ground about what's happening and what you can do in your community, but take the next step up. You know, these are social decisions that we're making in many cases. Like, most of the problems that we face at a social level, at society levels, are the result of, well, not the result of, but can be dealt with particular choices that get made. We are not powerless. We have agency in the world that we're living in. And so the more that we can provide that longer context, without being judgmental, again, not making doom and gloom stories, but really about, here's the status of where we are, here's how we got here, here's why, here's where we can go forward, then that's a positive impact and a positive contribution to the discourse, which I think we could all agree we could use more of.
Brilliant. So Giulio, this is a question I'm going to direct at you, because we've talked about it before, and this is something you've written about before. It's quite a delicate topic, but it relates to Cape Town and the Cape Town story. What caused the problem seems to tap into potential issues of racism and equity. And Elizabeth, who's asked this question, said, it seems to me terribly important to make this link between issues of climate change and issues of structural systemic racism. Is work being done, maybe akin to this project or elsewhere, to raise awareness about this or to tackle the challenge?
Yeah, it's totally true that it's inextricably linked to the policies and politics of places, right? I mean, what happens to the landscape is an issue of power in the end. Now, in the case of Cape Town, it's not so much that the problem was caused by the history of racism in South Africa, as much as the impacts were disproportionately distributed. So if you ask yourself who was risking the most out of the situation in Cape Town, of course, of the 4 million people that are living in Cape Town today, it wasn't the wealthiest few who have access to their own purification systems and can tank a water in. It was the vast number of people who were living Khayelitsha, who were living in the impoverished parts of the city that would suffer the consequences. And so I think it's, you know, certainly the impacts are very unevenly distributed. And in some cases, the land use practices themselves are the reflection of systemic and structural injustices or inequalities that need to be addressed. And I think conservation work doesn't have a great history of being sort of aware and visible, right? And so I think it's absolutely right that we need to become much more literate and much more open to kind of seeing these as whole social, ecosystem, and policy issues, right? I mean, they're so integrated: political, economic, social, and environmental issues. And it's only in that way that you can really kind of address them in the long term. I should add, by the way, just as a side note, one of the reasons that gives me hope in these kinds of interventions is that the work in Cape Town, as is true of the work of much conservation work, is that it's quite labor intensive. And so it ends up becoming an opportunity for employment. And in fact, the first Mandela government did start similar work, trying to eradicate invasive species, and it was called the Work for Water program. And it was a massive intervention in the 90s to try and employ a lot of people. And so I think that the promise of this work is to also not deliver just environmental results, but it's also potentially to deliver really significant social and economic results.
Thanks, Giulio. We are approaching the end of our time, and we have one last question, and I'm going to invoke my moderator license here and use this last question and add to it. And so the question goes to all three of you, and Verity, I'm going to start with you. And this is from Philip Livingston. He said, concerning the rainforests of South America or Asia or the savannas of Africa, do you ever worry that in the face of rapid population increases that you're just trying to bail out the Titanic? So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question from me is, in the face of that, what gives you hope?
Well, I can say that I did feel like that, and I've spent many, many years feeling like that. And what has changed that for me has been working on the age of nature. You sort of get a fatigue, don't you, with the state of the world, and we're sort of bombarded with doom and gloom stories in the press and media. So sort of to take a stand against that and say, well, we're not going to dwell on the issues. We all know what the problems are. We can sort of examine those problems, but we're not going to dwell on the misery of those problems. We're going to look at the solutions, and we're going to look at the way forward. It does make you feel better. And when you feel better, you can perk up a little bit and start exploring further about how you can be more positive with your work. And because we found, again, time and time again, you know, the stories that we showed you were perhaps 5% of the stories that we found and researched and discovered. So, you know, if you look at, I don't honestly know how sort of the balance is tipped and how you can compare the disasters to the successes. But all I know is that the momentum gathered by focusing on the positive is a really powerful force, and it does work.
Bill, you feeling optimistic?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, you know, the thing that Verity just said is exactly true. I mean, we tend to look at the horror stories and forget that there are some really interesting, productive solutions that are being put forth. And, you know, also one of the things that Giulio said, I think people who work in conservation science are the first to tell you that the real key to a lot of conservation development is the human development, is the stories of the folks who are in those communities. When you benefit these people and we try to build a better society, then conservation can come with it. And I think stories like the China one on the List Plateau or in Panama, it's an example of a problem that was enormous of scale. And you know, the scale was enormous of what the issues were, but the solutions came about and it was solved. So I think it requires really clear-eyed analysis of what's really happening and an acknowledgement that governments have a role in this. This isn't something that we all individually have to do. And, you know, certainly as the public broadcasters, not our place to advocate for particular policies, but we do want to put forth that the information is there, and it's up to, you know, organizations that we're working with to try to push in those directions. Certainly population explosion in some countries does have an impact on the environment, but thoughtfully done, there are ways to mitigate some of those negative impacts, and the Earth should be able to carry us if we respond in the right way. And there are some really interesting examples all over the world of where there are some successful stories of that. You know, one of the things we didn't, it wasn't in this film, but, you know, we've worked with Giulio in the past about the story of New York City and how, you know, they have the champagne of water, right? They use it as a natural solution to filter their water. There are solutions to navigate these challenges if we choose to take them on. And that is on all of us to try to really focus our representatives to keep nature in the picture, because it is the answer.
And finally, to you, Giulio, we had a comment from someone saying hope is not a strategy. I'm going to paraphrase that and say optimism is not a strategy. But what do you see from a strategic perspective, from within TNC and beyond, that makes you that keeps you going?
Hope and optimism are not strategies, but they are fuel, and so we live off them. But indeed, strategy is important here, and it's not, you know, none of these things are easy, and they're wicked problems, and you know, there's in ways that I don't have, you know, the time to get into. I will say this, however, you know, all of the problems that the series highlights are man-made. And they're not man-made because there's 7 billion of us, because in truth, they're man-made by a small percentage of the population that consumes an enormous amount. So this idea that the problem is there's too many of us is actually a non-issue. That's not the issue. The issue is that there's a few of us that consume an enormous amount of the resources of this planet. And what this series has shown, and what our work shows all the time, is that if choices that we've made have created these problems, we have choices that solve them. Now, how you scale them, how you get everybody to understand it, that's complicated, right? But certainly one good step is to make sure that everybody has the same picture in their head as to what the future looks like. And this series has done that, I think, has created a vision for what the future could look like. Of course, then it's all of our work collectively to try and make it happen. It's not like we don't know what needs to happen, and we kind of know what we need to do to make it happen. It's a question of working at it and, you know, fighting the right battle.
And as you say, hope and optimism are the fuel for that fight. We are at time. Verity, Bill, Giulio, thank you all so much for your time and for your very personal and professional perspectives on nature and on the age of nature. The link to the series was in the chat room, so if you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend that you do. It's really inspiring and just thoroughly good watch. Thank you all very, very much for your time.